We are going through the final days over in Geneva just last week. Part 1 of our show went out to critical acclaim. Everybody loved it. They were hoping their favourite brands would appear in Part 1. Well, maybe they'll appear in Part 2. Who knows? And if you're joining us for the first time, we would definitely appreciate a like, a comment and a subscription to our YouTube channel, because we're growing and we're trying to bring lots of people along for the ride. And speaking of a good ride, Dave is here.
Well, thank you very much for that. Yes, David was a very good ride.
But we should just crack on and get down to business, get down to brass tacks and talk about the first day that we've not covered yet. And that started off with Daniel Roth.
It was one of the hotels that was not that far away, but far enough away that it involved a little walk, which of course, as we talked about in the last episode, caused a few issues when it came to timings of getting to the next appointment. But nonetheless, we went along to see a couple of the more premium LVMH watch brands that they have, that being Daniel Roth, of course, as we mentioned, but also the new Gerald Gentas. And I think it's fair to say we were fairly taken by them. We got to see some prototypes and we also got to see some of the early production pieces from both brands. But I think of the two, possibly the Gerald Gentas, and one model in particular was really appealing to us. But yes, I think it was a little prickly, the one that we enjoyed seeing.
It was nice to see changes afoot with the Gerald Genta brand. Obviously, we've had Gerald Genta's wife and daughter on the show on previous occasions. Always great chat with them. We should probably get them back for a third go. But the ones they had on display, one is in the public domain at the moment. I have seen it on their Instagram. And the other ones we saw were different colourways and iterations of the same. And they're very cool looking. They reminded me of a Scottish thistle. They were very prickly on the outside. Some maybe had diamonds, some maybe it was precious metal. And then you had a faceted, almost like a massive diamond in the centre as the main crystal. Simona obviously really liked it. There was a black leather one with a bund. And then there were different colourways that will start to filter out over the coming weeks and months. But then the Daniel Roth that we got to see, it had a very unique shape and a very unique movement.
They have their first new movements, which were produced by the Fabrique du Temps, which I believe is the name. Somewhere we visited actually a few days after this. We'll get to that later in the show. But yes, they've now got access to obviously some pretty premium watchmaking skill sets from the guys at Louis Vuitton. We need to be careful here because there was a few things that were under embargo and we're maybe slightly hesitant about this one because we can remember what some are but not others. But check out the show notes and you will see pictures of things that we're allowed to talk about at this point. And of course, if you're watching this on YouTube, they will be flashing in front of your very eyes. But after that, where did we have to mosey along to?
Back to Beau Rivage and along to see Trilobe or Trilobe, depending on how you want to pronounce it, and we're not very good at either of those pronunciations. A French brand that have been doing amazing things at very low cost for a number of years now. They still have their first iterations, their first series available, because I did ask if they have shelved them and moved forward. So the entirety of the collection is available if somebody wants to buy, and we're not talking 20 grand, 30 grand, 40 grand starting price, we're talking around about 10, which is pretty incredible for what you get. And the design philosophy has been carried forward. Instead of just being flat on a dial, they actually do ones where it's almost like, I don't know, looking at a world underwater, Aquaman, something like that, with crazy dome arrangements. And again, the price point is not that crazy.
Trilobe hit the market, I think around about maybe just over 2 years ago now. And to be honest, hit the market with a bit of a splash, something slightly different from normal, obviously using these kind of moving time discs, couple of different variations on the same theme, but amazingly looking pretty different. Everything from quite modern looking to a little bit more traditional. And with this, I'm not sure if it's a full in-house movement, but I think it's a proprietary movement that only they have access to. I think they put a bit of design work into it as well. Typically quite thin watches here. I really like these watches. They didn't have anything massively new per se at this one, more themes on what they've already had, but obviously good to see them going from strength to strength.
Next up, we went to the area downstairs in Beau Rivage where a lot of independent creators were housed. We talked about them in the last edition, and it was the chance for us to catch up with Nevada Grenchen. And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correct, but I'm going to go with it. And the main man there, you wouldn't expect this guy, G will call him, because I can't pronounce his name either. We wouldn't expect this guy to run 3 independent watch brands, some resurrected names of the past, some absolutely brand new. But he is so on the money, his creative talents are unbounded, and again we're talking pocket-friendly prices. And because the kind of theme of the show this time around was consolidation, consideration, not blowing your load on crazy expensive timepieces left, right and centre, the guys that were doing things at maybe 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, they were the ones that were getting a lot of attention. And the Nevada stuff was cool. They had a reinterpretation of a model that was out maybe 40 years ago, where if you looked at it, you thought the dial was upside down because the chrono registers were kind of at the top at the 12 and over at the 9 instead of the usual way around. And then he showed us a few other things. We'd mentioned their problem with Vulcain, so he showed us their new desk clock, which is a lump of metal with 3 independent faces, a little bit like the type of thing you would see perhaps many years ago in a train station or an airport, where you've got the different clock faces. And then Simona was over the moon because he produced some very tiny little watches that he said, we're thinking of bringing these out. Would this be a good idea? And I came up with the idea that maybe, yes, if you bring these out, these could be good as a present for a significant other. Maybe an anniversary, a wedding, a birthday, something like that. Or, as I coined the term, the peacemaker. Because getting yourself a gift and then getting your significant other a gift means that you get away scot-free.
Well, you hope you get away scot-free. That's worked for you so far, but let's see how that pans out in the long term. But yes, it's nice to see these guys kind of reinvigorating or bringing back to life some historical brands, obviously with Invidegränchen being one of them, Vulcain being another, but then also bringing something completely new to the market with the likes of Space One, which is really just a modern take, something, I guess you could maybe call it Urwork-ish, something like that. But, you know, just a nice mix of kind of new and bringing back historical pieces as well, and bringing them back at pretty sensible, accessible.
Dave, we'll talk about Space One later because we caught up with them too, don't you worry. Next, we made a bit of a travel across to the Four Seasons Hotel, and we got to see a brand that is kind of new. They've got one model out just now, and they were busy telling us how it's now a two-man team. There is an extra person on board.
This is a watch that we covered, if I remember rightly. Can't remember exactly how long ago, but it was certainly within the last couple of months. They kind of, with a bit of a bang, brought to the market their new watch, something I love, super 70s inspired. If I remember the conversation correctly, he comes from a kind of high horology background, but has a bit of a love of vintage sports cars, supercars, kind of old Formula One cars, old GT cars, that kind of feel and vibe. And this watch has lots of unique little features, a kind of very faceted case, a pretty cool crystal going on here as well. Actually a remarkably wearable size, not tiny, but at the same point, not absolutely massive for something that's so structural in its makeup. But yeah, I absolutely love this watch. Not a crazy price either, considering what we're talking about in terms of specification of a watch here. Just really nice to see him, and as Ricky says, introduced the latest member of the team. It was a one-man band, it's now a two-man band.
Moving from there, we went across to what's known as the Glass Box, and this is right beside the main marquee at Geneva Watch Days, across the road from Beau Rivage. Keep this in mind if you're coming next year, because we're going to be organising a trip for loads of people, considering what happened this time around. And in the Glass Box, it wasn't a presentation from Moe's on Studio Underdog like the previous day. It was from Behrens, which is a Chinese company that is just doing incredible work at incredibly low prices. We bang on all the time about your iPhone coming from China, so yes, good quality stuff comes from there if it's designed as such, and if you're willing to pay the price as such. So these guys had Suzanne Wong on stage, they had a local representative from the Embassy of China that's in Geneva, and they were saying thank you for Switzerland and Geneva Watch Days inviting them to talk and present. And on stage, Suzanne started talking about a watch that then a video played, then a watch came out, and we were looking at it thinking, okay, it's custom, it's got a custom tourbillon, it's got a kind of moon phase or a day-night indicator globe, it's to do with Batman, so it's his Bruce Wayne, it's got the Batman logo there, and we thought, okay, maybe 12 grand, 20 grand, something like that. Dave, how much was this?
I believe it was in and around the 6,000 mark, and if I'm, again, not mistaken, this is a brand that was the first Chinese watch brand that's been kind of officially invited to take part in the Geneva Watch Days show, and they, hit the stage with a bit of a bang, because this watch blew people out the water, especially when they saw it, because it looked really cool, lots of nice technical specifications, a really nicely done watch, considering it was definitely that kind of Batman cartoon themed watch. Not too cheap in any way, like sometimes these watches can be. And of course, as we mentioned, that price point being considerably lower than anyone was expecting it to be. So much so, in fact, that it sold out within a couple of hours and it was all gone.
It was. And we were all gone. Back to the same place we were just before to see G and the guys at Space One. We've seen them before. We've seen the models. They are massively successful and they've got new colour iterations. They had a carbon one, they had a titanium, and they were explaining how each titanium version is completely unique because they have to use the blowtorch on each one to heat treat them and give that blue starburst effect on it, as if it's a shuttle re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. So good to catch up with them, have a look at their astronomic, I don't even know the name of the type of thing. It's a tellurium. That's it, tellurium. See, my memory's coming back, and they had a little demonstration of it, similar to what we saw in Watches and Wonders time. But again, we had more people with us, and every time we were going to meet a brand, we would say, yeah, we kind of know the history. It's a potted history, so fill in the blanks and tell the other guys that are with us. And we always pick up some new things because they always tell the story in a slightly different way.
Then we had to get our legs working again and over to a different venue to see William Massena, who was there representing or showing off a new brand, Albishorn. He's not directly linked to the brand, but has helped them with some of their kind of styling and some ideas to do with their business. Obviously, William Massena has been, with his Massena Labs business, involved with many brands over the last few years. This one, though, is a yacht time, a regatta type watch, and it's from people within the industry. They work for Sellita. I think they're some of the engineers for them, but have decided to set up their own little brand as a bit of a side project. They've done quite a lot of modifications to the brand. It is absolutely based on a Sellita, as you would probably expect for people that work for them. And they've done what they've had to do to make this into a working regatta timer. I actually really quite like to look at this watch. Not the world's biggest fan of regatta timers, but this one is something quite special. In fact, I think Ricky was rather taken by it.
Yeah, we got introduced to the guy behind the scenes here, and his name's Sebastian. Ain't going to butcher the second name. Look in the show notes. Show notes, we've got them. Miziel didn't get sacked last week. He did a great job putting all the pictures, the text spec, and the links in a chronological order, so you can actually scroll through, and if you like the sound of some of the watches and the looks of them, if you're following us on YouTube, then you can find out more. You can click across, you can get the details that you desire on each of the models we're talking about. And Sebastian, you're right, works for Sellita, quite high up, has written a book, something to do with chronographs. He showed me on Amazon, so he knows what he's talking about. And he is always thinking of new ideas. His mind is always wandering, a little bit like me and Dave when we're not recording shows. And instead of just sticking to the day job and coming home and playing video games, he comes home and he designs new movements and new add-ons and new ways of displaying time. And while he was there showing us the watch, he was actually revising it in his mind and saying, oh, well, what I want to do next is to take this lollipop hand and make it more of a ring so you can see the indicator on the dial behind it when it sweeps around. So a fantastic gentleman, good to catch up with William. He is a cheeky bastard, really is. I mean, he fitted perfectly when we had him on the show, and he was just giving it tight to everybody in the room. Love him. So he's going to be on again soon. Don't worry about that. And then we moved on somewhere else, Dave.
We did. We went to see our friends at Maurice Lacroix, a brand that we have talked about often over the years because fundamentally, they do some lovely looking watches. Now, we need to be careful here because we get shown some things that are under embargo and other things that we can definitely talk about, but they do have an all new icon in titanium with a purple dial, which was rather fetching. I have to say, the introduction of the titanium is something that they've done it, I think, in a couple of models, but it's now within the core range and in both of the key sizes as well. So nice to see them doing that. Although what they are bringing out that we can't talk about is something that had made Ricky a very happy boy.
I bumped into, now I've got to be careful here, but I'm not giving the game away fully. I bumped into George Bamford, as did Dave, on the lobby stairs in Beau Rivage, and he was wearing his favourite collab watch, which is the Richard-Perregaux Laureato Ghost, white ceramic bracelet. And I was looking at it saying, do you ever find any of these on the secondary market? And he says, no, I never do, because my wife wants one and I've been looking to get one. And Maurice Lacroix, I don't know, Dave. I'm not going to say anymore. Where do we go next?
We went to see Mauron Musy, a brand that we saw, I think, for the first time last year, if I remember, if my fuddled brain isn't losing me, which is entirely possible. But we met up with Stephen Lee there because obviously he represents this brand in the UK market. This was, as we mentioned, the second time we've seen them, and they've got some quite interesting pieces, especially the way they construct cases. They like to avoid using O-rings and seals where they can, and they use a rather interesting and rather complicated way of keeping their cases watertight.
Yeah, we did talk about this last year, and I asked for a refresher because we had friends with us and I wanted to remember what was going on. And he showed us this time. He had actual blocks and showed how the case comes together. And then you slide the separate parts in the corners and it just links, almost like the cube from Hellraiser. Hope he doesn't mind me saying that. Or one of those new things that you get where there's been a puzzle machined out of a solid lump of metal and it's so perfectly put together, micron perfect, that when you slip them together, they slide in and they're invisible. The way these cases are put together, no gaskets, no glues, no sealants. And it was just fantastic to see it all come together and then click at the end. So have a look in the show notes, have a look at the YouTube video for details on that. And they might be coming on the show because they expressed an interest in perhaps telling everybody a little bit more about what they do. And some of the models, wow. There was one that looked like an Audemars Piguet concept watch. It was a collaboration with another designer, and I just loved this thing. Price point, a little bit more expensive than the other ones we've been talking about due to the technology and the tolerances that are involved. But again, crazy looking watches, great graphic design underneath the sapphire, and tons going to be happening with that brand over the coming months.
Then, unfortunately, I had to take a little 30 to 40 minute break as I had some business meetings to attend to with my day job. But at that point, Ricky went along with Stephen Lee to see a couple of other brands that he represents in the UK, those being Tutima and Perrelet. So over to Ricky to tell you all about what he saw there.
Well, that's correct. And anybody that is new to the show, because we picked up some new listeners, some new followers, and some new subscribers on YouTube, thanks to Geneva Watch Days and all the content that's been coming around it. This was a brand that was introduced to me by Stephen Lee, and Stephen's been on the show recently himself, explaining about his brand, the way he got into horology, moving from the police, and been a little bit scared of people stabbing him on the street, and thought the watch industry would be a bit safer. Well, he introduced me to Perrelet, to Mauron Musy, and Tutima, because Tutima is a brand I always thought of as making those black and yellow watches. That is what stands out in my mind. Obviously they do, but underneath the surface, wow, they have got so much more going on. They've got minute repeaters. They were showing us the gong technology they use. They were showing us the movements that they use, the precious metal, the really high horology pieces that they had on display that go up to over 100,000. But they start at a much lower price point. So it's good to see a brand that can totally traverse that chasm of low cost to high horology and everything in between. It was good sitting down with somebody we'd never spoken to before, having a friend with us to introduce us to the right people, to ask the right questions. So we've got lots of little video clips, lots of pictures, and if you're interested in finding out more, details will be in the show notes.
Your mind wanders, Dion. You forgot all about Perrelet.
Well, who could forget Perrelet? I certainly didn't, because they were on the show just a few weeks ago there, and I got to meet Hugo for the first time in real life and got to see some of the embargoed pieces, some of the new releases, and they had one of their movements, one of their peripheral rotor movements on display where I could actually have a look at it, rotate it, play with it, and examine it in great detail. They've got Soprod in-house, so when they talk about in-house movements, it's a little bit like Swatch Group talking about some of the Powermatic 80s and other things like that by having ETA in-house. Similar idea with Perrelet, and yeah, keep an eye on what they've got coming down the line, because I think people will be quite interested, and it's a little bit different from what you've seen before.
And then we moved on and I rejoined the crowd as we visited Singer. They had the watch of the show as far as I was concerned. That's not to put the downer on anything else, because we saw lots of lovely watches, but I'm someone that's known for liking a chunkier watch, an uglier watch, a very impractical watch for day-to-day wear. Things like the Ultra Deep from Omega, I love it. Flow Pro from Omega, I love big chunky dive watches. And when we got to Singer, a brand that we always visit every year because they do some lovely things, we got to visit them. We love their Agionor movements. We love what they do. They've had some coffee timers. They've had all sorts of weird and wonderful timers, but they had a monster of a dive watch, and I absolutely loved it. Doing what they usually do, which is sometimes taking time away from the main dial of the watch, and in the case of this one, only having a chronographed dive timer on display where you would normally expect to read the time. Then having a disc arrangement, not that different to, for example, the Mad one from MB&F Mad Galleries, on the side of the watch where you could tell the time, because, you know, when you're underwater, probably less concerned with the actual time, more concerned with how much oxygen you have left before you die. So yes, I absolutely loved this watch. Completely impractical, huge, chunky, quite expensive, I remember, around 70,000. Yeah, nothing about it says sensible, but we love watches, and why should we have sensible when we don't really need them? So yes, that was absolutely pretty much, I'm sure, the watch of the show for me.
This smaller version of the watch, do you want to tell us a quick little bit about this?
So this is a resonance, and this is something that very few watch brands do. You will probably have heard of the FP Journe resonance, and you may have heard of the general concept, having effectively two separate watches within one watch, with the idea being that both of them, when they're running, bring a synchronicity across the watches for more accurate timekeeping. Various different ways of doing it. In the case of the Arm & Strong, there is a link between them in some fashion, but it is their resonance watch, which is something that they're quite famous for. Previously, it's been a rather large and imposing presence on one's wrist, but they've managed to get it into a still relatively large but more compact wrist form, shall we say, which makes it that little bit more wearable as a day-to-day watch.
Can't remember what we did after that. It was night time. I'm sure we ended up over at the Marquee for some kind of thing. It might have been the closing day picnic or some random bollocks like that. But the following day, we didn't head to Beau Rivage. We actually headed the opposite way, and we ended up in the main area where you've got Jacob & Co, you've got Bucherer, you've got Prada, Louis Vuitton, Richard Mille, etc. And we went along to the Archa boutique. And this is something we wanted to do when we went across to Watches and Wonders, but we just didn't find the time. Plus, Archa were in the main thoroughfare inside the PAL Expo. This time around, it was quiet, it was sedate, it was a Sunday, and we got a lot of time and a lot of wrist presence with some of the models that they had on show.
Now, this is a brand that we have again talked about in the past on the show, especially when they bring out their little tricky secrets when it comes to crystal cased watches, where they have been one of the first, if not the first on the market, that have brought colour changing or light reactive crystals into their watches. These are ones that may, for example, show a bluey hue, but when they're moved with under light, they change to a completely different colour. And this is something that's always been a watch that we've wanted to see up close, and in fact, it turned out they had more than one example of this. We also got quite a few surprises. A brand that has some rather punchy price points where they need to have them, but also have some remarkably accessible price points, which put a bit of a puzzled look on both mine and Ricky's face when we saw these. Do you mean 4,000? And yes, indeed, they did actually mean an entry-level point of 4,000 Swiss francs.
I thought they were kidding on, because when the guy kept saying, oh, from 4K, I would immediately pounce and say, show me what you mean by 4K. And I was expecting some dog shit to come out. And he kept moving the conversation along a little bit. Eventually, at the end of our time, I said, show me the fucking watch. And he pulls out this incredible looking watch that was fully skeletonized. Amazing. I didn't recognise the movement. Obviously, it's not something extremely special, but the way it was done, the way it was presented, the case and everything, for 4K entry for this brand, when they were showing us unique pieces at $500,000, there was one that was a Russian roulette style where there was a chamber of a gun that would rotate round. There was another one that actually had real bullets inside it and other craziness. So it's a brand that does all kinds of stuff, doesn't get talked enough about, I don't think. And again, the guy behind the scenes has been doing this for decades, and he was involved with the likes of AP and such back in the day.
And another interesting thing they brought up was that huge numbers of their watches are actually piece uniques, because they'll always tweak them a little bit, change them a little bit here, change them a little bit there, just to make them different. So they're not really into the business of doing sequential manufacture. And the chances are, if you ever pick one of their watches up, you will never see another like it in the wild, which is always something a little bit special when it comes to watches.
And special watches is what HYT is all about. Introduced to us a number of years ago, thanks to Barbara Plumbo and Pietro Limited Edition. I believe they actually sent us some watches to play with maybe 4 or 5 years ago. We did some video clips back in the day, and things have moved on. There have been many changings of the guard at CEO level, but the brand is here. It has got its historic range, which we've seen, we know we love. It's got the pumps inside it, the NASA technology, the world's second most expensive liquid after scorpion venom. And again, we asked for the full breakdown of how it all works, because there's always a nugget of information we get told, even though we've heard this story before. And we just were blown away with not only the stuff that they've got out already, but the brand new stuff that they showed to us. They've taken it back a little bit. They've made it more wearable, slightly smaller, more refined, hiding a lot of the technology so that if you want to see it, you can take it off the wrist and admire it like a clear case back instead of having the full engine on display on the front. They still do models like that. They still do crazy things with all the globes and spinning moons and all the rest of it at slightly higher price points, but they're doing great things. They've proven that they're going to stick around because they've not really stopped over the past X amount of years. And I'm quite liking what HYT are up to these days. What are your thoughts on the current range?
I'm really pleased that they've kind of brought an entry level, and I say entry level slightly guardedly because obviously they are still at reasonably premium price points, but they have now moved into an entry point that's not stratospheric, keeping that liquid technology, keeping that unique way of telling the time, but also in a infinitely more wearable package and something that doesn't look quite as completely crazy and out there.
From HYT to Bethune, or Dave Bethune.
Well, Dave Bethune was the person that was there looking at the day Bethune. We got to see a couple of their new releases based on models that have previously existed, but this time they had a meteorite dial, which had been treated with, well, can you guess, something very purple. Absolutely loved this watch. We got out onto the balcony again. We weren't even being watched. Well, that's because they trust us now.
Yeah, this is one of Tim Mosso's favourite brands. He talks about them all the time on his shows. He talked to them a little bit when he was on for our 600th episode. Bit of a call back to that one if you missed it, because we launched it while we were at Geneva Watch Days. One to go back and listen to it because the comments we had on that are phenomenal. Even people that found Tim Mosso on his own a little bit dry and concise, the fact he was with friends and we were chatting about watches, he really came out of his shell. So definitely one to go back and listen to after you finish this episode. Next up, another prior guest to the show, and that is Bjorn from Lindiverland. He is kind of appeared and then he disappears and then he pops back up with a press release and a new release. Very small numbers per year he produces, but he's always updating things. He's got a couple of different lines at different price points, and this time around I was captivated with the little black and white numbers. But you got to have a look at these too. What were your thoughts?
Again, something that appeals to me, chunkier, slightly unusual, and maybe not the most wearable watch when it comes to if you want to wear a suit or cuffs. But if you're like me and you enjoy t-shirts and not wearing anything too formal, these will absolutely be right up your street. He's done a few collaborations in the past with our friend James Thompson, the Black Badger. He actually had that one there and we got to look at it because Simona hadn't seen that one before. And of course, as you would expect, anything that James had his fingers in, the loom was pretty spectacular. But yeah, the releases he had for this one, a bit more reserved. Not going to say it's a reserved watch, reserved for Lindiverland. These were the white and black series ones, a bit more sedate, and as we know, Ricky likes any watch that's got punchy white in it, so he was rather taken by these. I love them. I think Ricky loved this as well. Good to see him kind of still being there, still working away hard. This is a brand that's a little bit different. You have to like the aesthetic of this, and it's definitely not a mainstream aesthetic. That said, there's always a place for something a bit different in the world of watches.
Absolutely fantastic, and good to catch up with people in real life. First time meeting this guy, and he's just as much of a joy sitting down, having a chat as he was over Zoom.
And after we had seen those wares, we went to see something a little unusual. Now let's see if I can get the pronunciation right. Guebly is, I think, how you say it. Would you agree, Ricky?
Yeah, I think I would agree, but we were actually located where we had breakfast with Konstantin Chaikin just a couple of days before, and this gentleman was in the corner, very softly spoken. He wasn't jumping around crazy like some of the folks that we've mentioned before, and he just produced a watch and took us on a journey through the creation process. He's an avid collector, has been for years. He's got Richard Mille, he's got AP, he's got Rolex, etc., but he's also got the crazy creators, the Voutilainens, those types of people, FP Journe. So he knows watches, and he wanted to make something that took the best parts from all these designs, all these backgrounds and ethoses, and he produced something in collaboration with these high horology guys that when he showed us it, eventually getting to the crux point, we looked at it, we examined it, he gave us an extremely powerful loop, we spent a lot of time looking at it, and we're trying to guess the price. And at the end of the day, it was in the 30,000 mark, which is insane because that's the kind of money you would pay for a good Moser, for, well, not even MB&F, but other brands that are further down in the price categories. So this blew me away for what it was. It's almost as if he was producing it at cost.
I think, in fact, he used the word passion project. It was something that, as long as he covered his bases and wasn't going to lose money, this was something he was doing more for friends and aficionados of horology, because he had been lucky enough to be in a position that he was allowed to do so, reaching out to many of the masters within the watchmaking sphere and get them together to make this piece that was his, I guess, dream watch. And he did a very, very good job, if I may say so. But then it was on to see my namesake, someone that is always fun to get involved with, that being David at Raketa.
I was puzzled there. I didn't know we met anyone called Bobag. Yeah, Raketa, round the corner in the same building. It's always good to catch up in real life with David because he's not Russian. He's not British. He's a kind of amalgamation. He's a mongrel. A mixture of all the different places in the world. And we've had them on the show a number of times over the years before special operations and such like. But he is still working away hard. He's still putting bread on the table for his workers, making sure that mouths are fed. And he had a couple of changes to the models that were already out. He had a new Copernicus, he had a new Big Zero, he had lots of things. Dave, tell us more about it.
So we've not had David on the show for about 3 years, maybe slightly longer, but we've had him and we've been talking about what he's been doing since he took over Raketa. A very honest individual who says, if I was to do it again, would he do it? Well, he knows that he's a bit of a madman when it comes to it. He took the whole business on knowing absolutely nothing about watches, but had more of a fixation on taking on a legacy company and allowing it to survive and to thrive and grow. He bit off a lot when it came to Raketa. Very old infrastructure, very old buildings, and as it turned out, most of the staff were pretty much nearing the end of their working lives. So he's had to invigorate the company pretty much from the ground up, establishing a watchmaking school because there were none left in Russia, getting young people trained up, and of course putting money and investment into both the machinery and also the factory. He was really proud to show us the work he'd done in terms of modernising the factory, making it brighter, fresher, and the whole new boutique concept that they're beginning to roll out as well, bringing the whites and the reds you would expect to see in many of the Raketa movements and watches to life in a boutique and factory setting. He's really done some amazing things, and hopefully once certain challenges are past and memories are long forgotten, the brand will really begin to stretch its legs and show us what they can do, because they are a bit like areas of Germany and other areas of the world doing their own thing their own way, and they do some really interesting pieces. Ricky's always been a big fan of the vintage pieces and of course the newer ones, and we did a collaboration watch with them a couple of years ago that actually turned out very well and sold out, so much so that I was even asked recently by somebody within the trade if I would let my piece go, to which the answer was, I'm afraid not.
I was also asked if I would let my piece go, but I've always got a firm grasp on my piece, so I didn't let it go whatsoever, and I want the full collection of all limited edition Scottish watches, so no. But yeah, it's really good to see David is doing what he can considering the circumstances, considering he is caught in the crossfire, no pun intended, with things there. But moving on from there,
we went to a brand that has possibly one of the best names of a watch company that I've come across, that being Krayon, spelt with a K. So they obviously have the spelling affliction that we also have. In fact, not so much we, more Miziel in the show notes, although he is getting better as he matures. His spelling or ability to use a spell checker is improving. But yes, we got to see Krayon, who have some rather punchy colourways. This was a brand that got Ricky's eyes glinting because he rather liked it, along with Simona, of course.
I'd heard of the Krayon Anywhere from a number of years ago, and I didn't know anything about the brand. I've seen them advertised a few places when we've been across in Dubai, when we've been at different events, and I've never really spent any time. But as I mentioned in the previous edition of the show, I wanted to expand my horizons and therefore bring new things to our audience, because it's all about learning. There are many channels out there, there are many live streams out there, and they just talk about Rolex all the time. Rolex release watches once a year if you're lucky, and they change the bezel colour if you're extremely lucky. We just like looking at everything, price point from the low to the high, things we could afford, things we could never attain. And with Krayon, I would say it's mid-level price point wise, but what you get, Jesus Christ, the craziness under the sapphire, the way that you can program in the sunset and the sunrise depending on where you are in the world, and it will actually display round the outer circumference of the minute track. The colour scheme, the way the dial's put together, it looked like a silicon wafer, the inside of a CPU, but in a very metallic green colour, the one that I looked at anyway. Really impressed. The guy that was there was humble as could be considering the crazy creation that were in front of us, and fingers crossed we can get a press piece across to check out in real life and spend more than the half hour that we had with him.
And then we rushed off to see Gruebel a brand that definitely operate at the more premium end of the price sector of watches, it has to be said. Obviously their big thing being hand finishing. 6,000 hours of finishing is the number we were giving, and having seen it, we could definitely believe that. Then we got on to see...
Hey, Face.
Yes?
Before you run away, I was going to say that, I've enjoyed about 6,000 hours of hand finishing myself at some points. But anyway, we moved on from there and we went back across to the independent salon down the stairs, and it was a brand called Depancel. I thought, what's this? Is this a name from the past? No, it's an amalgamation of three, classic car brands that have unfortunately faded away, and they took the different parts of the words that made up those individual names, crushed them together, created a great little brand.
Definitely at the opposite end of the pricing spectrum when it comes to Gruebel who we'd been at previously, but that made them nonetheless attractive. Of course, the beauty of watches is there is lots of price points and lots of things available. They were doing some really cool kind of motorsport inspired vintage heritage brands from the motoring world. All these little things they were putting together, and they were bringing them to a package that I have to say was done very tastefully. Not overtly out there car orientated, but good looking watches with a nice little backstory.
And again, we moved across to see the guys from Behrens, the folks that had been displaying the Batman watch previously. We got to sit down with their master creator. Doesn't speak English, neither do we, so we needed two translators in the middle.
We had some excellent translators, which allowed us to have a look at the weird and wonderful watches that they produce within their range. There was a couple of them that really did appeal to me. If you like that Urworky, MB&F-y type vibe, something a bit left field, something definitely not of the norm, I think that there could be a few different things within there that will really appeal to you. Check out the show notes because you'll see the pictures in there of a few of them. Lovely attention to detail, not at the super entry level price point, but at the same time, if you're in the sub 1,000 to 3,000 type price category, they will have many offerings in there that are actually pretty special.
From the case shapes, the layouts, the designs, to the straps, to everything integrated together. Some of these watches were in crazy colours. There was a completely red cased, red strapped one that I looked at and thought, how does this work? Reminded me of the UN watch last year with the marquetry, where all the components were kind of dial side, but it didn't look like they were connected. And again, the price point here was sub 10,000. I can't even remember, but it was not inexpensive, because obviously nothing is inexpensive, but crazy affordable for what you were getting. And there were a few people we noticed walking around who were wearing Behrens watches, and they stood out like a sore thumb. So it was really good to sit down and speak to the team, find out about all the crazy creations that were on the desk in front of us. And again, if we can get somebody from the brand to maybe converse with us and come on, obviously it will not be the man at the top, because that would make for a very difficult listening experience for you. But I think we can promote what they're doing, get out to a wider audience, because I'm in love with it. And if I like it, chances are you might like it too.
Then it was off to the second meeting of Bernard Lederer. I had to go and do some secret squirrel stuff, so this one was left again in the reasonably capable hands of Ricky, who got to go and talk about what he was actually up to, because we didn't get enough time in the first meeting.
Got to throw it back to Pietro. He has been working behind the scenes to get some things moving with us both, Bernard Lederer, the team there, and ourselves. And we met him the day before. And he is a giant of a man. He's got the biggest, fattest, chunkiest fingers ever. Huge hands, like giant haystacks or somebody like that at the big show. And I'm thinking, how does he manipulate tiny watch components? Never got to the bottom of that. We did get to the bottom of him managing to conjure up solutions to decades, if not centuries, old watchmaking problems. But that is something we're going to talk about in a future show. He was amazing to speak to, so much so our first meeting, which was the only one scheduled, we ran out of time. He was busy talking about watchmaking, didn't get to see the products, never got to see the watches. So we booked in, came back, and we sat down. He was busy that time, thankfully, otherwise it would have been more tall tales to tell. But we got to look at the watches, we got to examine them. And the fact that some of them, I can't remember what it's called, maybe the Inverto or the Inverso, it's one where the collectors loved the look of the movement. They wanted the hands on that side, and they released that watch.
And then over to see the guys at Ming. We always try and catch up with them when they're about. a brand that's had a bit of a ballistic trajectory when it comes to what they've done, starting off with watches in and around the $1,000 mark and now producing watches that are considerably more expensive in some cases, but not forgetting their roots. They got to show us some very light things and some very heavy things. They're always a bit cheeky, they're always a bit lively with us. So yes, Ricky, what did you make of the rather featherweight watch?
Well, I got my first introduction to Ming, the brand, when we met one of the guys in charge over at Dubai Watch Week last year. And he was pretty cool, pretty chilled, was on our wavelength. But when we met them this time, I didn't know the other players. So I was in the room, and it turns out the main man, Ming, himself was there. And he was like throwing in oddball comments from the back. And I'm like, who's this guy? But anyway, as the conversation kept going, I started to pick up the fact that he could have been the fourth wheel or the fifth wheel or the sixth wheel from Scottish Watches, because his humour levels were on par with me and Dave. And they produced these little scales, drug scales, so we thought, placed them down and said, measure this watch, now measure this watch, and check the weight of this thing, it's made of magnesium, and check the weight of this thing, it's made of tantalum. And before you know it, we'd gone through the entire half-hour meeting, we'd looked at fantastic timepieces, we'd talked about history, we'd talked about this, that and the other. They even had a 3D printed, it looked like a bong, right? A futuristic sci-fi bong. And instead of a lighter, you would, well, funnily enough, you would put a light in one end, and you'd look down it, and you'd be able to see the lume on the watch. Fantastic idea. I wonder where they get that from.
I wonder indeed. But yes, we saw everything from an 8-gram watch through to a rather weighty tantalum piece. We saw bracelets that they've been working on. We saw all of the little areas of technology that these guys get their fingers in and about. Then it was round 2 of round 2. We had to see Bernard Lederer twice, so that meant we also had to see Xavier from Czapek twice. We had seen him a couple...
not really twice, Dave. Once, really.
Well, once really, but we did get to say hello the first time, but he had no time because he had been in the midst of a recording when he was meant to be seeing us, but we can't blame him because we've overrun when it's come to some of our appointments, but he very kindly decided he would make time for us later in the week, and surely he did. We actually got to have a sit down with him and a bit of a talk about how the brand's been doing, how the industry is, and what's going on, good, bad, and indifferent as well. So we always got a little bit of an insight to that. We got to hear what's been doing well. The promenade that they launched back at Watches and Wonders has been a standout success, especially that Ripple dial one. The one that we very much thought would be as successful has turned out to be just that. But I think there was a couple of interesting things they showed that we're probably not allowed to talk about, are we?
We are allowed to talk about some things, and one of those things is the latest iterations of the Antarctic. The thing that they're probably most famous for is their Royal Oak, and instead of just doing something basic, something simple, they decided to change the index markers, the hour markers. Instead of being batons made of precious metal, usually white gold, they have got little diamonds, but it's not the usual round diamonds or the usual ones that you would see in a Rolex or a whatever. They've actually cut the diamond in a specific shape and pattern that emulates the normal markers on their normal Antarctic range, and they have some patents and IP on this process because they don't want everybody else stealing it. And it's one of those, you look at it, you look away and your brain says something's not quite right and you have to double take. They also have the dials and aventurine, which is very popular, as you've seen with maybe our Formex recently, still available. I think there's about 8 pieces left, but it was good. And Xavier is a no bullshit kind of guy. He talks about the way the company works, the shareholders, the fact there's more people involved, more people wanting to get involved, and what's working and what isn't working, because obviously there's been a massive change in the industry over the past 12 months or so, and he's there telling you it like it is. When we had him on the show just before Watches and Wonders, when we launched Promenade with them, he was very open and honest then, and even more so today. So they're doing great things. They've got some cool stuff coming. We're not allowed to talk about it, but we do have pictures, we do have video clips, so they will be coming as soon as we're allowed to. Good ending to the week. There were a couple of things that we did that we get asked to do that were slightly out with Geneva Watch Days itself, and we don't have time to talk about them, but that was an invitation to go and do 2 factory tours, and they were phenomenal. Back to back on the one day. Probably wouldn't recommend anyone does that, because after the first one, we were done. But by the time we got to the second one, we were elevated again, caffeinated and ready to rock. But you're just going to have to tune into the next episode to find out all about these.
They are well worth tuning in. So the Thursday show this week is something you should be listening to if you want to hear about our lack of skills when it comes to some finessed watchmaking.
And that is where we're going to leave it. So thank you for following us on our journey this time around to Geneva Watch Days 2024. It was better than the last one, but the last one was really good. So that tells you how good this one was. We met so many people, we caught up with so many folks. Horological Dictionary, Stephen Lee, Pietro from Limited Edition, all our friends, lots of listeners, lots of brands, at least 3 people from different brands, micro brands, slightly larger ones, turned up specifically to meet us and say hello in real life because they listen to the show, they watch us on YouTube, and the atmosphere is electric from start to finish. It's one of those events that we're going to harp on about because you can go and you can travel and you can see things. You don't have to register and pay money or be on a waiting list or be a VIP. You grab yourself a cheap Airbnb, you grab yourself a cheap hotel room and you come along and you just enjoy it. There is no cost to get involved in all the stuff that's going on. So fully recommend it. Hopefully we can actually work with the guys at Geneva Watch Days next year. We tried this year, didn't really get very far, but next year we're going to give it a good bash so we can entice more folks to come along because the people that did come with us, they loved it.
Exactly. So next year it will be our turn to be Who's Scottish Watches.
Yes, you're all invited to Scottish Watches Days next year over in Geneva. And that is it. So be sure to follow us if you're on YouTube. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Oh, and if you want to email us, info@scottishwatches.co.uk. That's the place to be. Do not DM us on Instagram. It ain't worth your time or our time. We'll never see it. And have a look at our website, scottishwatches.co.uk. Lots of roundups, previews, reviews, opinion pieces. And again, if you're interested in perhaps collaborating, writing something for the website, getting out to the masses, drop us an email. And that's about it. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you again soon.